to the Enlightenment Podcast to our listeners and viewers around the world. In these pivotal times, engaging in meaningful dialogue on Palestine is essential, we find, to providing deeper insight and context, while highlighting Palestine's rich traditions, history, and culture, which is often, sadly, we feel, overlooked by mainstream legacy media or misrepresented. Today, we have a wonderful guest for you. We're joined by Dr. Sara Husseini to talk about the importance of Palestinian representation through political and strategic advocacy, and hopefully the quest that we all seem to be on for a just solution. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you, Shamim. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. A brief bio for you. Dr. Sara Husseini is the director of the British Palestinian Committee. This is an independent, diaspora-led organisation that is focused on political and strategic advocacy in the UK. She currently sits on the boards of Britain-Palestine Centre and the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, the PIPD. In previous roles, Sara has served as an advisor to senior Palestinian officials across a number of offices, including Secretary General of the PLO and the Palestinian Ambassador to Germany, as well as 3 years with the Global Philanthropic Collective Compact. She holds a BA in German Studies and European History, a Master's in Islamic Studies, great range there, and a PhD in Early Christian-Muslim Relations, all from the University of Birmingham in the UK. Hanan, our in-depth first question, as always, how did you meet Sara?
Well, my lovely cousin, Dr. Victor Kattan, set up a British Palestinian group, a wonderful group of people in response to the genocide on Gaza, and introduced us and me to the brilliant Dr. Sara, who's doing crucial work. And we also did an earlier podcast with Victor, so I highly recommend it for those who haven't seen it yet. But welcome and ahlan, Sara. And shall we start with your dad's side of the family? He was a 1967 Nakba survivor when over 300,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced. And that was a continuation of the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe, with over 750,000 Palestinians, again, who were ethnically cleansed, including my mother from West Jerusalem. So for people who don't know the background. So your dad is from Jerusalem. Your family, the Husseinis, played a crucial role in Palestinian resistance and politics during the British Mandate and the Palestinian Revolt in the 30s, from 1936 onwards. Sara, could you share your family's history in Palestine leading up to your dad's and his family's expulsion from Palestine?
Yeah, certainly. Well, it's quite a long one, as all of our Palestinian history is. And as you said, he's from Jerusalem, so he was born on the Mount of Olives in 1952. He's actually the son of two Jerusalem families. So his mother, Layla, was a Khalidi, and she grew up in West Jerusalem in the Qatamon neighborhood before Israel colonized that in 1948, that part of Jerusalem. Her father, actually, a gentleman named Hussein Fakhri al-Khalidi, was the mayor of Jerusalem in the 1930s. And he was exiled by the British to the Seychelles, along with 4 other Palestinian leaders at the time, in an attempt to, remove political agency from the Palestinians during the British mandate. And then, yes, on the other side, his father, the Husseini, was Haider al-Husseini, who was the nephew of a man named Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, who will be no stranger in Palestinian history. Abdul Qadir was one of the fighters during the revolt that you mentioned between 36 and 39. He was fought in a few different places and ways. He was exiled a number of times. He eventually was killed in 1948 during the Nakba, fighting a battle to try and regain an important village called Al-Qastal in Jerusalem, or near Jerusalem. So yeah, both sides of the family quite deep Jerusalemites and quite deeply embedded from my father's side.
Yeah. And very prominent families, for those who don't know, in Jerusalem and Palestine. Yeah.
And so then my father, who was, as I say, born in 52 on the Mount of Olives, when in 1967, when Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, including East Jerusalem, he was in Amman at the time with his family. His father had work there, and so he was just never able to go back. He was never able to return. The first time he actually did go back was, I think, in 1994, and that was after coming to the UK to study, meeting my mother, marrying her in 1979, and finally gaining a British passport somewhere in the early 90s, which then enabled him to go home on a tourist visa on a British passport. So that was his trajectory. But yeah, he did. I mean, my father did quite a lot of work so he was actually the founding director of Medical Aid for Palestinians, which is a big charity that here in the UK. And then managed to go back actually with that passport. He went back to Palestine from the mid-90s, and he was able to work in Palestine here and there somehow, despite not having any kind of ability to stay there permanently. And actually his last job before he retired he was the director of Al-Maqasid Hospital in Jerusalem, which is one of the big Jerusalem hospitals that is obviously very important in terms of providing healthcare and services to Palestinians, but actually is also a very important political national symbol, as many of the institutions in Jerusalem are, in terms of keeping Palestinians rooted in their homes. So that was his last role. And then there was a point where he tried to come back into Palestine, and the Israeli occupation wouldn't let him in anymore and told him that his time was done. And so he retired, and now he moves around between a few different places, including the UK and his sister in Amman.
Yeah.
And just to say that MAP, the medical, says, well, what your dad founded is a very important organization to help on all things medical. And like a lot of Palestinians, you can only go with a foreign passport to your own homeland, which is really sad. Yeah.
And not even then, it seems sometimes. So it's a really sad, tragic story. I was very excited by this little detail that I found out, is that most people don't realize that in the 7th century, I think, the Christian churches in Palestine entrusted the keys of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the old city of Jerusalem to 2 Muslim families as co-custodians, the Nasavis and your family, the Husseinis, who up to this day, I think, still open and close the church doors every day, which is like an image that I wish I could put on film as a filmmaker. I bring this up also because it highlights the historic and a very strong relationship between Christian and Muslim Palestinians, which I've always heard about from Hanan, whose family is Christian Palestinian. I'd love to hear anything more you have about this beautiful tradition, and also about, we talked about your dad going back to Palestine, but when you visited Palestine for the first time, when was that, and what did you observe? What were your feelings around that?
I think interesting, that's quite tied, because I think the first time I went back, one of the things that I did notice that I wasn't really aware of was actually how much of a non-issue religion is in some ways. Like, it sounds really crazy because we're talking about, you know, Palestine and Jerusalem and the cradle of the 3 Abrahamic faiths of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and all of those things, of course, are true, and there is religious significance for people in the Holy Land. It is the Holy Land. But actually, in terms of day to day, I'd be working with colleagues like Victor, for example, and you would have no sense of anybody being Christian or Muslim unless, you know, they were wearing a cross or wearing the hijab, or it was just not something that, you know, so many people attach talk about Palestine as a religious problem, or think it's a religious conflict between religions, and it's never been about that. It's always been about this, you know, settler colonial project that has come to a country that has tried to replace one population with another population, but that's not actually on the basis of religion, even though, you know, there are religious elements to it. So I think that was, and I think the story that you dug up about the Husseinis and the Shibis opening the church is quite a beautiful and poetic kind of symbol of that. So yeah, I'm trying to think about when I first went. It was 1994 at Christmas, and I would have been about 11 years old at that point. I think first things I really realized was just how much family was a thing. It's so important. Obviously, growing up in the UK, we have family here, and I love my family dearly, but families here tend to be much more kind of nuclear and smaller. I think going there and realizing how many cousins and extended family and aunties and uncles I had that didn't feel distant, they felt really, really close. And ever since then, every time I've gone back or I've lived in Palestine, you know, I've always been visiting, you know, cousins of cousins and third cousins, but you wouldn't even think that they just all feel like the family that you go and see on a weekend or whenever you have free time, or during Ramadan for iftars, or, you know. So I think that sense of understanding that concept of family and how it differs a little bit to sort of Western cultures was really, really eye-opening and important. obviously food. I can't you can't go to Palestine and not talk about how amazing the food the food was back home, and having home cooked food and things like that. But then obviously there's the horrors of occupation, of colonialism, of apartheid. And I think even, you think about being children and you sort of protected somewhat from some of it because, your parents aren't going to tell you all of the horrific things that are happening and not going to point everything out. But even at, the age of 11, you could understand that different cars had different coloured number plates. And that if you have a certain coloured number plate, so I mean, to sort of give a bit more background to this for the listeners, I guess, the license plates, yellow license plates are reserved for Israeli cars, basically, or cars issued by Israel. And Palestinians have to drive with either the sort of green plates or white plates, and they actually distinguish who you are effectively in a car. And therefore, when you are driving, the chances of being stopped, the chances of having to queue at checkpoints while other cars can go straight through, is such a visible indicator of apartheid. It's not a difficult concept to grasp even as a child. And yet, how long has it taken for much of the international community to understand that there's an apartheid in Palestine? How long is it still taking many, many governments to not accept that terminology yet, to not accept some of these legal categories that international experts, Palestinians, have been attesting to for decades? There's so much there that I think is, and this speaks to the kind of whitewashing and the media's role and things that we'll get into in a bit, I'm sure. But yeah, I just think understanding the kind of injustice, even at a young age, it's not hard because it's not complicated. And people, there's a lot of talk about Palestine and that issue and it being complicated. It really isn't.
I couldn't agree more. My parents grew up in apartheid South Africa and eventually left because they were moved around so much as different areas were designated white areas. What's happening in Palestine, where you could be living in a village and suddenly it's happening in Batir and places like that right now, where they're now being designated as settler land. It's not their land. It's just being purely stolen from under them, or being, as you say, tagged by your license plate, by your paperwork, by all of these things. There's no doubt that it is a clear case of racist apartheid, but it's also quite brilliant brainwashing on many, many levels, in my opinion. Anyway.
Absolutely.
The other thing I'm just remembering actually as well, the other thing I remember is just sort of my going through all of these checkpoints and having to, the journeys that people have to make on a daily basis, and not just that, the humiliation that people have to go through to even get to school or a hospital, or, and some days you wait for hours and some days you don't get there at all. And it really depends on the whim of usually a teenage soldier, occupying your land. And I just remember a story my grandmother always told about how they used to drive from Amman to Jerusalem in like 45 or 50 minutes. You just get in the car and it was like the same place. You just drive across, and it makes me so sad because that is, it's such a small area, and it would be so easy to do if that were just Palestine, our land, and open as it should be. And I don't know, it's just a very small thing, but it always made me really, really sad, like thinking about it. And seeing
I think they make it as hard as possible because they don't want us to keep visiting, or they want to discourage Palestinians from going back. And they make it brutally uncomfortable for us to keep, wanting to see our family and our homeland, basically. But Sara, so what led to your line of work, and what influenced your choices and what you do?
I think there's a story in the family that goes back to this is now my aunt, who's my dad's sister. She lives in Amman. And we always joke that when I was very young, I spent a couple of years living in Amman. That was a story about how we went back there to visit at some point, and my father actually then had his passport taken away. We have Jordanian passports, and he had his passport taken by the Mukhabarat, the Jordanian intelligence services, and was made to go and sit in the intelligence services every day for 18 months effectively. So we all moved over there for 18 months, 2 years. At the time, I had no idea. I was like 4 years old. That was the reason. But anyway, the story goes that my aunt used to tried to sit me down when I was really young and tell me the story of the Palestinians and tell me the history. And apparently I used to refuse all the time and just say, oh no, Auntie Tima, not that story again. Like, I don't want to hear it again. It's, I've heard it too many times. And nowadays, because obviously I'm now in this line of work and what I do is all about advocacy and representing the story of the Palestinians, the joke is that my aunt is done with it now. She's heard enough and she'd like just to have a quiet rest of her life, but I keep telling her the story now. So, but I think effectively as I got older, I think a lot of us who grew up outside sort of started to become mobilized and learned a bit more, usually kind of during like formative teenage years, university years. That's what happened to me. I went to university, just started to read more, learn more, ask my father more questions. And then eventually, after I finished my PhD here, I went over to work in Palestine. And I think from then, it was never really a choice. It's never felt like my line of work hasn't really felt like a choice. It's just felt like something that, I recognize I'm in a real place of privilege by, in some ways, obviously not being able to go home and live there, but at the same time, I'm not there when people are being, bombed and devastated. So I think it just feels like anything that I can do, I need to do. And in that way, it actually makes life a little bit easy, because choice, I think, can be paralyzing sometimes.
Yeah, it's great when it feels more like a calling than a decision for your career. Sarah, I'm a novelist and filmmaker. Hanan and I both make movies. So we're very, keen on the power of words, images, storytelling to challenge narratives, to humanize the other. Could you discuss the importance, if you feel it's important, for Palestinians to have representation which is untraditional or not traditional in Western media, let's say? How important is that kind of representation?
I mean, it's everything. It's so important. And I think it's probably the case for every, any marginalized people or community that has suffered a colonial legacy, who in then the Western media or Western spaces are underrepresented, I think, or misrepresented. I think that's a big problem, as you alluded to there, Shamim, in terms of, I remember being a kid at school and Palestinian terrorist jokes flying around and things like that, or being told, oh, Palestine doesn't exist, and you look at today, so it's not just about being underrepresented, it's about being, it's about the deep sort of racism that goes with being Palestinian. And I don't think I'd really fully understood it when I was younger. I think as I've grown older, I've come to understand it more. And obviously, as I think in the past few years, in this repression and the silencing of Palestinians has got way worse in many ways. Just seeing things like Palestinian flags being banned in a school in Leeds a couple of years ago because it was seen as a call to terrorism or anti-Semitic, or our very being and inherited, our very being is somehow offensive to other people. So I think there's a real pervasive racism that goes along with it that I think is often not actually seen by others. I think there's a deliberate bypassing of Palestinians from conversations about Palestine. So even when there are a lot of conversations around Palestine, actually Palestinians themselves aren't often represented. And that can be at, the very simple levels, in panels and things where you'll see, I've been to panels before. I used to work in Germany, which is a whole other kettle of fish, but I go to panels on Palestine and you'd have, 2 white German men, an Israeli, and maybe a Jordanian or something, or an Egyptian, and you just sit there and say, how do people not recognize that the people who need to be in this conversation need to be the people who are most impacted by it? And then that bypassing has just become, it feeds into it at so many levels. I mean, if you look at things like, plans for rebuilding or reconstructing Gaza, when all of this horrific nightmare is, if it ever ends, it ends. So much of those plans are all about doing things that bypass Palestinians. The Abraham Accords that, Donald Trump pushed from 2020 onwards and others are all about Arab countries normalizing relationships with Israel without any say from Palestinians. So it kind of works on lots of levels. And I think a really important part as well, and part of the reason and one of the main core things we're trying to do with the British Palestinian Committee is recognizing that it's not just underrepresentation or misrepresentation. It's actually when we are being represented or we are invited to speak, the terms in which we're invited to engage are often completely not conducive to actually listening to what Palestinians have to say. So I'd say, for example, the number of times that we've been invited to something and you can go and be on a panel if you're having an Israeli legitimize your perspective. Palestinians have heard if somebody's there to balance them out effectively rather than speak on their own behalf. Or often, Palestinians will be invited into spaces to talk about their experience perhaps and how they're feeling, but aren't really seen as experts in their own rights, even though they will have studied certain subjects or whatever. So there's a lots of kind of very pervasive, quiet ways where actually, people are where people are realizing, oh, actually, we probably should have a Palestinian because optically it looks good if you've got somebody, to legitimize this conversation that's from the community being affected. But even then, there's so many times where that isn't actually a very genuine engagement or a genuine desire to hear from people. And so a lot of what we're trying to do with BPC is really challenge that and shift some of that. And I guess we'll probably talk more about that over the course, but yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then that, because you've done a lot of interviews, press and media, and that level of dehumanization of Palestinians really started in sort of end of 19th century when the Zionist movement started. And this whole, propaganda or Hasbara of a land without a people is so entrenched. And the Zionist settler colony of Israel was founded through the violent dispossession and systematic expulsion of Palestinians and their ethnic cleansing. So as you say, the Palestinians have endured decades of brutal oppression, illegal occupation, and they haven't been crushed. We continue to have sumud and resistance. But let's just step a little bit back and discuss Britain's historical role in Palestine and how it links to your work, because our listeners and audience probably don't know that.
Yeah. Well, Britain bears original responsibility for Palestine. And again, it's one of these things that as Palestinians, the Balfour Declaration of 1917 is seared in our consciousness. Everybody, is very aware of it. This was the promise that was made by Lord Arthur Balfour, the then Foreign Secretary of Britain, to essentially support the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people, as it was put, in Palestine. And the very key thing about that was, obviously, it was giving this land to a people, the land that already had another people in it, and the Palestinians were not even referenced in that. There's a reference to non-Jewish inhabitants of the land who would get some kind of basic social rights maybe, but no kind of national collective rights in this thing. And actually you've seen that play out through all the way through to today, and even the latest initiatives that are being pushed all over the place, most of them are these what we call economic peace initiatives. So this idea that as long as we give Palestinians, a house and a car and enough to live, and they can just get by day to day, they don't need national rights or collective rights, and that's, that thread is carried through. And I think what's really interesting though is it's so omitted here in Britain from the kind of public discourse space. So, at best, Britain's often sort of characterized as like a innocent bystander in the whole thing. We had the mandate for Palestine, and these people started fighting, or as a hapless arbiter. But actually, Britain has been the most remarkably consistent in aiding and abetting Palestinian dispossession from then to now. And not only, in terms of being the power that supported the Zionist project, but also trained militias and delivered weapons, and a lot of the colonial practices of like collective punishment and administrative detention, all these things, these practices we see the Israelis using against Palestinians now, many of them came from British. They've learned from the British. They learned from British colonial rule. And actually, it just reminds me of, I was chatting to my father just this past Christmas. And it's interesting because he now in his retirement has done a lot of reading about the history of Zionism, the history of British Empire and colonialism. And he was saying to me that had he understood back then just how bad Britain had been, just how, and not just in Palestine, in India, in all kinds of different places, but how bad the British Empire had been, he would never have moved to this country when he did to come and study, which I thought was interesting. I never heard him say that before. But yeah, Britain, and I think the other piece of this that's really important actually is if people do recognise that Britain has a role or had a role in this historically, they don't understand, it's sort of seen as history. But it's so present because, well, two things. The omission of the history means you're omitting the root causes. And so this is why all these this framing of two people fighting over land that were just there and can't get on, and it's an ethnic conflict, and all that framing then leads to all of these failed approaches towards policy making and towards that persisted over time. And again, it's why you get, all kinds of attempts to address this conflict, which again is not a conflict. A conflict is two sides fighting over something. This is a settled colonial project that that's manifested through various ways, through apartheid, through occupation, now through genocide. And without understanding that, there can never be a solution. Logically, there can never be a solution. Forget morally for a moment. And so I think it's just really, really important that people understand that the Britain's role is past, but Britain's role is also very present. I mean, we're talking about a government today who is delivering weapons to Israel, who's crucially making these really, really important parts of the F-35 fighter jet, without which Israel could not run the fighter jets, the US could not sell the fighter jets, is supporting with rhetoric and diplomatic and political and all kinds of political support. Keir Starmer, who we all saw that horrific LBC interview, and when the genocide first started, where he, a human rights lawyer, condoned the cutting off of water and power to Palestinians. He actually, a few years before that, in 2021, gave a speech to the Labour Friends of Israel annual lunch, where he literally used the colonial tropes of Zionists going over there and making the desert bloom. So it's this thing is happening very much now still. It's happening across all of our political establishment in the UK. And Britain is really, really very much complicit in this genocide. And I think that's the other piece of what we're really trying to focus on at BPC is a lot of the time we talk to policymakers about holding Israel accountable. Of course, that's absolutely imperative. Israel has to be held accountable. But actually, we really need to hold Britain accountable as well, and the US and every other country that is complicit in this genocide. And so we do a lot of focus on Britain's role and accountability for Britain, so that we're not, thinking in this, this kind of idea that the West is somehow going to come and save us, or that if we persuade the policymakers, if we get in the room and say the right things and they see that we're humans, they're going to change their policy. They're not. This is a historical and it's a current and a present thing. We can't sit here and expect, we're in the belly of the beast in Britain. We can't expect policymakers just to change their minds with nice words. It needs political pressure, it needs power, it needs all kinds of things. And so I think that focus really sharply on holding Britain accountable is actually as important almost as holding the US and others, because without them, Israel can't do what it's doing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And also just to add a couple of points to what you just said about the present, I think Britain still owns 3 or 4% of Cyprus, and during the genocide in Gaza, they have a base there. They own, and so they would do flights and get all the data and intelligence and share it with the settler colony of Israel as well as the Americans. So they're very much part of this genocide. And also, as you say, the F-35 parts. I mean, the settler colony of Israel is very dependent on bombing everywhere from Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and so on. So it's a very important, because they're not very strong on the ground. They're stronger. Well, they're a bit what do you call it? I don't know if stronger, but it's very cowardly to bomb people from the air. So yeah, Britain is very, very, very much to blame for that right now.
One of our main focuses at the moment. So we released a report just in January. Actually, we had a fantastic young researcher who put that together. He basically went through all the open source material on British collaboration, military collaboration with Israel, and published a report at BPC that we launched in Parliament at the end of January that says basically this goes far beyond the arms export licenses that everyone talks about. So yeah, F-35s, and to your excellent point, Hanan, the Cyprus RAF bases. I think they sent something like between December 2023 and June of 2024, there were 2 surveillance flights a day going to Gaza. We used to move military equipment. There's been a lot of deep technological partnerships with Israel. I mean, there was an announcement a couple of days ago that a guy called Sinead Carter, who was British government, I forget actually now what his role was in the British government. He's ex-British government. He's now become one of the key advisors to Israeli military firms. And so I mean, the connections are so deep and so much further than, the arms sales licenses question, which is usually the one that comes up. So I think a focus on that is a big part of what we're trying to do at BPC. And so, yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
So, but back to BPC again, I understand that, and you want to get Britain to sort of admit or be aware of the culpability, the depth of the issues. But when a report like this that you said, highlighting these long and deeper ties between Britain and Israel on the military front is presented to Parliament, What happened and what would you like to happen? What is the goal? How do you hope to achieve that breakthrough? Because it does sometimes feel as if, like you say, these ties are there. There's clearly monetary ties. I think there's donations. There are all sorts of things, and it's even worse in the States, where the vast majority of elected officials are taking money from AIPAC. How do you hope to break through this? Are there particular ways that you have in mind?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, speaking specifically on the parliamentary level, so for example, we released this report, and we have also, in terms of Parliament, we have a really brilliant parliamentary officer who's mapped Parliament across the board and has effectively categorised people in terms of MPs in terms of how sympathetic, how understanding they are of Palestine and the Palestinian cause. And I think with different groups of MPs, the aim slightly different. So I think with something like military collaboration, we're looking at the very strongest MPs who understand, and it's not a huge number, but they are willing to be outspoken and willing to speak. And so with them, it's about giving them this kind of information that they can go and then scrutinise Parliament. So they can then go and ask questions of the Ministry of Defence, and that actually happens. So the MP who chaired our parliamentary launch then managed to get a Westminster Hall debate just a week ago on this issue, which in and of itself, I mean, it's a balloted thing, so it's supposed to be at random, but to have a parliamentary debate on Britain's military collaboration with Israel is not been, I don't think there's been anything like that before. Yeah. And then he was then able to use the report and other things, because there are a number of organisations who are brilliant organisations working on military collaboration. So you'll know there's a court case at the moment that Al-Haq is leading with GLAN and a few others around the F-35 part specifically. And so together in the campaigns against arms trade, there's a number of organisations working together. So it's all about giving MPs who are strong the information ability to scrutinise. I think it's about starting to educate some of those who might be sympathetic but don't understand the depth of the collaboration. And I think it's about shifting public opinion and narrative so that when we get to another election, people are much more aware of what's happening and know how to sort of vet who they want to vote for in terms of things that they care about, and Palestine being one of them.
Yeah.
No, I agree completely. And Sara, could you talk a bit more about the experience of Palestinians in the UK, the importance of community, having a movement, and also we're having a lot more pro-Palestinian voices support us, but how can we amplify and strengthen these voices and really make a difference, seismic difference, if you like, once and for all?
Yeah, okay. I think there's two questions. One is the experiences side, and then I guess it's how we strengthen things. I think we talked a little bit before about the level of and the depth of kind of racism in this country. And I remember we were talking, so as I said, with the BPC, what we do is Parliament is one space, but we're trying to work in key decision-making spaces across British public life. So that might be, with the exec boards of cultural institutions or the editors of news desks. And I remember having one conversation with a number of university vice-chancellors with Palestinian students and academics in the UK about their experiences. And trying to get them to understand the different levels of trauma, actually, that, if you're a Palestinian student or academic, particularly from Gaza, for example, right now, not only have you faced how many wars, 6 wars since if you were 18, you've probably been through war 6 times in Gaza through the Israelis bombarding. This is just the most horrific version of that. So you're facing a direct genocide. Your family and friends back home are either being slaughtered or being displaced, or then you've got so that's the sort of first level of trauma and the need for support that Palestinian students and academics have, for example. Then you've got this notion, actually, I know we mentioned this a little bit before, but these legal descriptions of what's happening, the reality can't be portrayed because it's being disputed. So if you're in university and your lecturers want to talk about genocide and apartheid, that's actually dangerous in some ways. These are things that are being, there's a trial at the International Court of Justice. Israel's on trial for genocide right now. The ICC has issued arrest warrants against Israeli leaders, Netanyahu and Gallant. And yet the spaces in the UK where that is deemed controversial, and so Palestinians are then being kind of gaslit to be told that this isn't how things are. Then when Palestinians try to stand up and speak and say, this is my experience or this is my history, or try to mobilize to protest against the horrors of what's happening back home, there's silencing, there's repression, you're treated as an agitator, you're interrogated, disbelieved. And And then you compound that with, in this case, universities, but all of this applies across all different institutions. The institutional silence of the institution that you're in, whether it's a university or just that universities who should be looking at their counterparts and their colleagues in Gaza and looking at the 12 higher education institutes that are literally all completely reduced to rubble, and seeing their colleagues who are in Gaza still teaching out of tents, despite being under heavy bombardment. The students are doing masters vivas and masters and PhD examinations. They're trekking miles to be able to get to WhatsApp to upload lectures and send answers and questions and keep doing, studying. I mean, we heard a stat in June of last year, so right in the middle of this genocide, I think it was Azhar University, 10,000 students registered online on June the 1st of the genocide. So desperate were they to continue trying to live their life and get their education. And these are the kinds of things that, like, not only them should be the most inspiring things in the world, but actually they're being silenced and repressed over here. So the experience, of Palestinians is, and I don't think it's not fully understood or seen or appreciated generally. We know it, I think, but I think it's so under the surface almost that it's not really appreciated. So I think there's that on that side. But by the same token, of course, Britain is home to some of the largest solidarity marches in global history. Palestinians are all over the world are actually, despite this repression, in some way speaking out even more fearlessly and more strongly than we ever have before, I think. And so it's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition. And we see people around us, I think, waking up as well. I think you see general public opinion has been shifting and changing. Despite the attempts by, and we've not really got into this yet, but I'm sure we will do, but despite the attempts by government and public discourse and media to kind of completely paint a different picture of the situation. Actually, I've known a lot of people who really haven't had any interest in Palestine, but over the past 16 months or so have started questioning what they're seeing on the BBC or questioning what they're seeing on Sky News, because they can also see what's happening on their phones, on social media. And there's a live stream genocide happening in front of them. They're seeing that what they're being told doesn't add up with what they're seeing in front of them. And so I think there's a lot of power in that. And I think Palestinians absolutely need to be at the forefront of taking back this agency of our own and leading in that fight. And again, I think that's part of the game, whether it's on the streets. And I think part of what we saw with the BPC, where we saw the gap, was that we see this movement that is really strong in the UK and solidarity demonstrations, and but what's happening is those kinds of organisations and were not getting a hearing really in policy making circles. They were seen as too radical, or just weren't getting the hearing. And the organisations actually who were in policy making spaces were often not Palestinian. They were often promoting, actually sort of, they talk about Palestinian rights, but are actually promoting kind of soft colonialism. So a number of organisations who are talking about Palestinian rights, but actually they're talking about fulfilling the Balfour Declaration. So we gave the Jews their part of the land, the Israelis and Israel. Now we need to give the Palestinians their part, not about rescinding the Balfour Declaration altogether, and that should have never happened. So I think it's about us as Palestinians in all spaces taking up that space and reframing this and reframing the narrative and the agenda, because the narrative has such a big impact on the policy ultimately. And so it's a long struggle, but I think it's joining that struggle up and making sure it's really part of a wider movement is really, really important. I don't know if I've answered the question there, but we can keep.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Sorry.
No, it's really good. Look, one of the reasons we started this podcast was to counter this legacy media, a vision of Palestinians that you've just touched on, which is very dehumanizing, and it very much takes the line that the West has somehow this moral superiority and this ability to transform things, and they are the rules-based order. I grew up believing it. I think we were all kind of just like given this as we grew up, especially, we're a little older than you. But I think everything that's happened in Gaza, as you mentioned, has really exposed this racism, this hypocrisy, because people are being able to see two different narratives in front of them. Now, public opinion, obviously very key to building awareness. As you said, there's been a very encouraging outpouring of support to foster a civically engaged society and to counter these years of Hasbara propaganda from the settler colonialists, which manufactured this narrative, to be honest. But there is this grassroots change. Can you talk a little bit more about why this is imperative and how can it help to counter Western governments and legacy media, and how do we scale that up, basically?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a big question. We've all, but I do think, I mean, I think let's look at the shift a little bit in a bit more detail really first. So, I mean, if we look at the election, the general election, 2024 in the UK, for example, although, you know, on the surface, it was like a Labour landslide victory, and we have a Labour Party now that is actually seems to have lost every single value that could be a Labour Party. And this is not just around Palestine, right? We're seeing all this, you know, taking away people's benefits. And I mean, this speaks to the fact that Palestine is actually part of, you know, very important and central to a number of other struggles that are all similar. But I mean, we can come back to that potentially. But I've lost the thread. What were we talking? Sorry.
No, I was asking.
I'm going off on a different tangent. You're asking about legacy media and the the general election I was going to talk about. Sorry. Yeah, so the general election, it looked like, you know, on the surface, Labour won something like 411 seats out of 600 or so. But actually, if you scratch beneath the surface, this was the very first time that Palestine became a domestic issue in the UK for voters. So we saw the election of 5 MPs based specifically on an anti-genocide platform. That's really unprecedented. You very rarely get independent MPs elected at all, let alone 5 on the basis of one issue. The Green Party went from 1 seat to 4 because they centred Palestine as an issue. And there were a lot of near misses. So, for example, I'll talk about Leanne Mohammed, who you might have come across. She's an incredible 24-year-old British Palestinian who took on Wes Streeting, who's now the Labour Health Secretary in her hometown of Ilford North, her home constituency. She came in within 528 votes of beating him with 1 seat. I mean, he's like Labour's, for people who don't live in the UK, this is, you know, was Labour's next leader in waiting at the time. So there was a real number of these examples. And actually, since we've been in Parliament since, and we've been meeting a lot of MPs, obviously, in this new government, and the number of times we meet with MPs who say, you know, well, I don't know much about Palestine, but my constituents really care about it, so I need to learn something. There's so many more of those. There's a lot of new Labour MPs as well who have come into the party, and to the sort of point I was starting to make before, have realised that actually the Labour values that they hold, the party is going very, very far towards the right from those. And so Palestine is one issue among many that they see as an issue of social, political, national justice. And so they're becoming more interested because they understand that you know, Palestine is central to some of these things as well. So I think there is a shift happening. It was you know, not, you know, it's not changed anything materially immediately, but it did put a dent in this 2-party politics machinery in the UK in a way that we've not seen before. And so I think there's something in that we really have to keep building on and working on.
Yeah. But do you think, Sarah, I mean, in the US, we had Genocide Joe and Harris, and then now Genocide Trump. And then in the UK, we had Starmer, and we know his views, and the genocidal sort of Tory party. So it feels like the choices are within 2 very Zionistic, pro-settler colonial powers. And yes, there was a little bit of a dent, which is great. But, you know, when we have a genocide going on, so are you saying that the best solution is to work within those existing parties, or to have a completely new paradigm shift and a change in outlook?
It's an interesting question, because I think that's a debate that a lot of people have around whether the Labour Party is salvageable at this point, given the way it's gone. And I mean, I'm not in politics or in the parties. I don't, you know, as I say, we're politically independent. But I think the point of the election was actually there were a number of elected candidates that were not of the 2 traditional parties that were elected. And I think if we look at that as a you know, small glimmer of hope, it's, you know, only a handful of seats in a bigger parliament. But I know, for example, Leanne is always talking about breaking the 2-party politics, supporting independence, building, you know, the 5 MPs who are independent have not formed a party, but they've formed an alliance. And like, it's very difficult to form political parties. So I don't want to be over optimistic about, you know, a brand new party just coming into the scene. But I think it's a combination. I think it's putting pressure on those in the parties that exist, and often it's just even just standing by their own policies and principles and calling out the hypocrisy. So, you know, for example, I think the previous administration, the Sunak administration, the genocide started October 2023, or at least this manifestation of Israel's, you know, colonization and the ways it has sought to effectively expel Palestinians since the Nakba onwards. That started in 2023. That phase of it, and in November 2023, so 1 month later, the then government published a 21-page intervention on the situation in Myanmar and the genocide against the Rohingya. And they, in that 21-page intervention with 5 other countries, argued for a really expansive definition of genocide, so that genocide should be basically give the benefit of the doubt. If it looks like genocide, it's probably genocide. They argued for a lower threshold when it comes to children. And we've now, maybe 20,000 children or more. We don't even know, given how many people are still buried under the rubble and how many people would die from secondary causes after not having medical care and all those kinds of things. But they argued they had a whole number of paragraphs on subsistence diets and starvation as a weapon of war. All these things we saw play out over the past 16 months. And so not only is it about it's about calling out this hypocrisy and holding the feet to the fire as much as possible in every single avenue, and building some parliamentary support in that, but also understanding there are limits to that, and we have to also build from the outside, build the movements, put pressure in lots of different ways, really.
Yeah. I think it's very encouraging that there is this sort of political awakening and global solidarity for Palestine. It feels a bit transformative compared to where we were a few years ago. And I think it's this idea of ethnic supremacy, as you say, seeing tens of thousands of children being killed, clear genocide as defined by the UN and various other legal entities. So we can talk about leveraging this collective power, as you just said, but the fact is that it feels now, since the election of Trump, since the Labour Party has come in, and everything going on in Germany, pro-Palestinian voices are being even more suppressed. I mean, we're getting, even within Jewish communities that oppose Zionism, they're also facing huge crackdowns. Recent example in point is the targeting of Mahmoud Khalil in the US. It's still, I think, in detention without charge, and also the crackdown on various university encampments in the US and UK. And we've seen, of course, Columbia Cave fold like a card table under Trump's demands to which are frankly fascist. Can you talk about this? Because is it that when people feel that threat of people power that they crack down more? What does history tell us, and how should we as activists try to make a meaningful impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely my sense of it, is that if you look around, the repression, as we've sort of talked about here in the UK, and you've just given that example in the US, of course, of and it's the worst it's potentially ever been, or it feels, at least in our lifetime, to me, that it's the worst in some ways that it's ever been. But I think it also, to me, speaks to the last dying, desperate throes of people trying to hold on to power and hold on to a narrative that just is beginning to crumble. I think you can see that in the fact that, despite the effort that is put in by politicians and Western media to push rhetorics of, self-defense for Israel, and occupying the idea of an occupying power defending itself against the people it's occupied and subjugated for decades. The way that, the double standards in the media in terms of, passive tenses use of Palestinians dying, whereas Israelis are killed, Israelis are always humanized. All these things, the most powerful machinery in the West, Trump obviously talked about, he's actually handing down, all of these harsh kind of retaliations and punishments, everything that's being thrown at it. And actually public opinion is, first of all, getting stronger in terms of favour of justice. People's eyes are actually more open to the fact, despite all of this effort. And as I say, it just feels like there's an overreach here, and there's a real thinness to this rhetoric that people all can see is not real. So it doesn't mean that it's not going to get worse and not going to be horrific in the now, but I think I always try to look ahead to the long arm of history and imagine that actually, I think in a lot of struggles against, like apartheid South Africa or others, it must have felt, this repression must have been felt quite keenly before actually there was a tipping point. And so I think for activists, I think all we can do really is just keep going and keep believing that actually the more we speak out and the more people are willing to do that. Yes, it might be hard, and yes, we might, you know, suffer consequences right now along the way, but I think it's all we can do. And I think it is a sign that we're getting closer to justice rather than further away, even though it sometimes feels the opposite. I mean, you put me on a hopeful day, it seems.
Right.
But
Hope is always very important. But Sarah, for example, we were driving back, we're in Toronto, Shamim is filming, directing a Netflix series, a new one. And we were driving past North Toronto just now, yesterday. And this whole area is extremely, not only very Zionist, but we were driving past big Israeli flags, big billboards saying supporting Israel, people that, you know, and it was, I thought I was in downtown Tel Aviv or something. It was really like the whole area with a lot of wealth, a lot of power, and a lot of organization. So we're facing, and there, you know, and there's an election coming up also in Canada. So it's really important to mobilize and to be smart about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
and to work together.
Good point about being smart about it. I think that's something else that is really, really important, is that a lot of the times when people, and this applies to the spaces we work in terms of politics, but I think it applies across the board, there's always this sense that if only we had the same amount of resources, or we did this, if we could do the same as our opponents, as the Zionists are doing, that's the way we fight fire, that's the way we'd achieve things. And actually, of course, it's a complete misreading of the situation, because the situation is we are in an asymmetric warfare. This is a very asymmetrical situation. And so the tools that we need to use towards justice and liberation are not going to be the same tools as they're using against us. And actually they shouldn't be, because I think there's a moral high ground there that we need to hold, and, you know, for all of humanity, not just Palestinians. So I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, no, I agree. And as Palestinians in the diaspora, I think we're privileged. It's our responsibility to take action and to speak out, and we have an important role to play, which you're playing a very important role. But I also believe that the Zionist project is an apartheid, ethno-supremacist, settler colonial regime. I think it is crumbling. It must be dismantled. And I think it's a matter of time. It's probably now things get worse before they get better. But solution-wise, I really strongly believe in a single democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea, irrespective of ethnicity, religion, equal rights for all, you know, and of course with justice and reparation and the right of return of all Palestinians, which, as we know, is recognized under international law. But from your perspective, what are your thoughts on the settler colony, and what do you think needs to happen? Yeah, what's your vision, basically, or what needs to happen?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think the thing that, like, we tell policymakers and everybody who we speak to is that ultimately it's our right as Palestinians collectively to decide what our future looks like. And so often, you know, we talk about the values and the core rights of self-determination and return, and a lot of people will talk about them, but they will understand self-determination, for example, as a two-state solution. Which is an imposed solution upon Palestinians, right? So, like, what we're trying to do is really shift that and just say, look, it's our choice, it's our business, how our right to self-determination. What you need to do is you need to abide by international law. You need to recognize that you know, our inalienable rights are enshrined in international law. So you, whatever country you are, whatever nation you are, and you also have obligations yourselves as third-party states. Whether it's not being, you know, whether it's from the ICJ advisory opinion that was handed down just last July, saying third-party states should not be aiding or assisting an unlawful occupation, that the opinion there was that Israel needed to withdraw immediately and pay reparations to the Palestinian people. So it's all there and it's all documented, and it needs political will. And so I think it's all again about having these powers that be understand what is their role and what is not their role. And it speaks to the whole idea of trying to do things as collectively as possible. And I think, again, the idea of having a formalized civil society diaspora organization with the BPC was the idea that it's, again, that it makes it harder for people to kind of pick us off and sort of bring us into a space and tokenize you as a Palestinian and just say, you know, we've heard your voice now, tick box, you know, go away again. If we've got a collection, if we're collective and we're clear on the principles and clear on really pushing for the you know, making clear the root cause, is really pushing for our rights to be fulfilled in a way that's collective and can hold a line, then it makes it a lot harder for people to kind of go around us and bypass us, which is often the case. So effectively, what I'd always say is just, it's our choice, but it doesn't matter, whatever the vision, the first step to a just future has to be accountability.
Yeah,
Israel.
Yeah, sure.
That's the
very much so. And as you say, the two-state solution is there will end up as Palestinians with less than 22%, with you know, Bantustan.
It's, I mean, it's flawed in so many ways, and yet, you know, it's empty rhetoric. Even if we wanted, let's say we wanted, for the sake of argument, we wanted a two-state solution. What two states are there? You know, this place is controlled from river to sea by Israel. It's the same way, you know, people talk about settlements and whether we should, you know, ban trade from the settlements and deal with the settlements. You can't deal with the settlements separately from Israel. They're deeply embedded into the Israeli economy. You can't boycott or you know, ban a product from a settlement and expect it to be able to be fulfilled or do anything. So I think reframing that as well and understanding, and again, it all comes back to understanding the history, Britain's role, how this happened, and what needs to change to be able to fix that. So it's a big sort of paradigm shift that's needed, and narrative shift. And so, yeah, I think this is why, you know, Palestinians need to be taking as much space and agency as possible. I think this is why, you know, the podcast that you have put together here is brilliant and really, really important, because there are so few spaces for Palestinians to really be able to speak on their own terms and freely without, you know, being pigeonholed into a certain agenda.
Exactly. Thank you, Sarah. But as you said, it's very important to understand the history. A lot of people say, why do you keep on going about history? But history is still alive and kicking and very much influencing what's happening now. So it's not like this hundreds and thousands of years. It's still going on. So it's really important for people to understand the history, to really see the injustice and what we're still going through as Palestinians.
Well, history has also been rewritten. Sorry, I'll drop in there, because that rewriting of history is informing what most people believe about Palestine, especially through mainstream legacy media. As you say, we want a two-state solution, says Israel, but in the meantime, we're putting nearly 1 million settlers on the land that is supposed to be the two states. So these two things do not connect as being honest.
And not even that now, right? Israel explicitly has been anti-two-state solution quite, you know, it used to be that the Israelis would be like, oh yeah, maybe. Now they're very explicit.
Yeah.
They're very explicit about what they're taking. I mean, and in word and deed, you know, there's so many, there's reams of documented evidence of genocidal language from Israeli officials. We know there's 2 days after the ceasefire took place in Gaza in January, 40,000 Palestinians were displaced from the West Bank, right? So like, it's very, very clear, you know, that they're not even, you know, it's not even paying lip service to two states. But I also think that's also part of this trajectory and Israeli overreach that will actually end up being the undoing of Zionism effectively.
Yeah,
it is. And Sarah, since you mentioned the ceasefire and the so-called ceasefire, I mean, they agreed to it as usual. They sign on it, and then they always break it, and they haven't even fulfilled the first phase, let alone. And yet, again, the Hasbara, they rewrite it that it's it's the Palestinians who broke the ceasefire. Do you have any thoughts on that before?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a classic Israeli playbook move. What was actually interesting is it didn't get bought at this time as much. Actually, what's really interesting, a little anecdote here, is I don't know if you saw, there was an interview very recently with Emily Thornberry. She's the head of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the UK. She's a Labour frontbencher, traditionally very supportive of Israel. And actually, she came out and did an interview about the ceasefire and laid it exactly as it should be at Netanyahu's door, at Israel's door, and said very clearly there was a ceasefire agreement, and we know that Israel didn't want to withdraw, that Netanyahu's clinging to power, all of those things, which is a real shift in tone for a Labour politician from the front bench. The interesting thing is that she, 2 weeks before that, or maybe 3 weeks before that, had been to the Israeli Knesset for meetings and was secretly filmed by people, by the Israelis. Parts of that were put out on social media, and she was so angry.
I saw that.
And
Yeah.
so she gave this interview. Now, I don't know what it means, how much it will shift things out, but it was such an interesting example of, the genocide wasn't the problem, but the Israelis filming her secretly was a big enough deal for her to then switch the whole rhetoric on and lay the blame at the door of Netanyahu and the Israelis. But I think at the point there is, I think people aren't buying it as much anymore. So the Israeli, the propaganda keeps going, but it is becoming more and more see-through.
Yeah. And also just to shout out for the Lebanese so-called ceasefire again throughout the ceasefire. And, the ceasefires are guaranteed by the Americans, supposedly, and others. They've been killing Lebanese every day, as well as killing Palestinians every day. And that's during the ceasefire. So it's just repackaging and the propaganda and selling it to the press and the media. What Shamim, you mentioned, the legacy media, who are really puppets of the Western governments, if you like.
And again, this speaks to the racism, right? The double standards. I mean, there were, I think, 155 Palestinians killed between the supposed ceasefire dates and the most recent, when over 400 Palestinians were killed, was it Tuesday of last week? When that hit the news, and it was almost like, and actually there was a statement that came out from the UN that I think must have been lost in translation, because I wouldn't expect it to be so bad. But there was a reference to, it said something about a meaningful number of civilians being killed. And I just thought, what's a meaningful number? So the fact that, if it's 1 or 2 a day, it's fine. But now it's the news because it's 400 in a night. And, so, I mean, yeah, there's a long way to go.
It's
still slaughtering of civilians.
It's horrific. But it's interesting in terms of that politician that you were talking about, how having a tiny taste of being watched, being filmed, being not, having her agency taken away in the smallest way by the Israeli authorities, sort of gave her that insight, that empathy, perhaps, into unimaginable humiliation that Palestinians deal with day after day after day, apart from the loss and the murder and the slaughter. I think that's what it takes, and that's part of the humanization fight that we're all in. We'll be putting links up for our listeners who are interested in learning more and in supporting the BPC's work. If you want to donate and also subscribe to their mailing list to see what's going on. But Sarah, are there any particular upcoming projects or goals that the BPC has that you wanted to share with us?
I mean, I think we talked a little bit about military complicity. I think British complicity in general, I think, is really, really important. I think we're doing quite a lot of focus on that, as I said, with other organisations in different ways, and working with MPs to educate them about Palestine and do some of that reframing work. I mean, we didn't really get into this, but we're doing quite an important piece of work around normalisation and the issues with normalisation and normalising the occupation of Palestine. So you might have seen, I don't know, but in the UK there's a push at the moment amongst the sort of government for this international peace fund that is set up actually originally in the US and run mainly by an organisation called the Alliance for Middle East Peace. It's basically all about coexistence projects, people-to-people projects, the sort of dialogue projects that came out of the Oslo Accords and the Oslo era that actually are all about just peace-building exercises without any intention of ending the occupation, ending the structural violence against Palestinians. And why they're particularly dangerous is because it's all about putting money into these initiatives that actually have no real support from Palestinian constituencies anywhere, apart from 1 or 2 organisations that again are being tokenized. But also it's taking critical funding away from things like UNRWA. These peace building projects have nothing to do with international law and are diverting attention, in fact, from accountability in international law. So they're the sort of thing that MPs will see and will think is a really great thing because, isn't it nice if Palestinians and Israelis learn to have peace with each other and talk with each other without actually realising the dangers of it, and actually how actually sort of disgraceful and shocking it is to even be thinking about asking Palestinians to come and do peace building activities with Israelis at a time of genocide. So, I mean, that's a piece of work that, there's things we need to do positively, but there's also things we need to do to make sure that certain things like that are being understood and being, stopped, basically. So there's a lot of work on that kind of stuff as well. But in general, just continuing to try and support the movement in the spaces that we work in, make sure that we're building based on broad consensus positions, based on our rights as Palestinians, and as I say, really trying to step up that representation and make sure we can bring more people, more Palestinians into those spaces to sort of speak from their own behalf.
Yeah, and Sara, all these so-called peace agreements and treaties and what have you have just made it worse and worse for the Palestinians. It's given the settler colony of Israel more time to build more settlements, to crush and brutally impose their repressive regimes against Palestinians. So it's just, it hasn't been, they keep saying that the Palestinians have broken every peace, but actually it's not at all. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic trope, isn't it? That's leveled at Palestinians, that we never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, or that we, reject these things. But no, there's never ever been a credible offer or a credible way to really, again, resolve the root causes of this issue, which is, there is a people in a land, and their land has been, imposed upon by what was effectively a European colonial project. And until that is really reckoned with, and I think it will be in the future. Narratives do shift and things do change, but yeah, this is all part and parcel of the
absolutely. So you have a lot on your shoulders to do, and you're doing fantastic work. We just need to speed it up to with the genocide and all the horrors that are happening, sadly. But Sara, any final thoughts or messages to our viewers, our audience, anything, and listeners, anything we haven't covered that you'd like to share?
I think all I would say is that there will be a time when people will look back and say that this genocide was the most horrific thing that happened, right? There'll be a time when everyone will have been against it, and no one will believe how anybody could have stayed silent during it. And there will be a day when Palestine will be free. I fully believe that. And I think until then, we just have to believe, we have to keep working. And our job is to really do everything in our power to get us as close to that tipping point as possible and as quickly as possible. Because as you mentioned, we're talking about the work we're doing at BBC and stuff. Obviously, we're trying to do good work, but it's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean when our people in Gaza and across Palestine are suffering in unimaginable ways. I mean, these are the people who shouldn't have to be inspiring to us. They should just be able to live life normally, but they are the ones who are inspiring. And I think just always recognizing those of us who are outside the privilege that we have in that, and using that privilege as best we can is really important. But just to say that I think I just imagine, and again, I imagine being in other movements in previous times in history, and it must have felt pretty dark before it changed. It must have felt like nothing was moving, and it must have felt like everyone was on the streets and boycotting, but governments weren't changing, and eventually they did. So we just have to hold on to the fact that that apartheid South Africa is a long struggle and is a continuing struggle. Vietnam was a long struggle. It took I don't know how long for the French to leave Algeria. Like, these things are in the long arm of history. These things do change, and so we just have to hold on to that belief and do whatever we can to get there.
I think
absolutely, I love that.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way, a beautiful end thought for people to take away. And again, I would encourage anybody who is thinking about this to reach out to other people, be supportive, and do everything that you can to raise your voice in whatever way possible, because it all does really make a difference. As we wrap up, then I guess thank you for joining us today. People-powered media is definitely, we feel, an alternative to quite a controlled legacy media, as we've been discussing in this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it, please share it, please subscribe to us, because that engagement really helps us to amplify voices dedicated to justice, to humanism, to humanity. Dr. Sara, thank you so much for your insight, for your dedication to justice for Palestinians, for all the incredible work that you do. It's really invaluable.
Thank you both. That is what you're doing. So يعطيكم ألف عافية.
Thank you.
Shukran. And just to add, stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, and above all, take action. Collective power, as Dr. Sara said, and a global movement is the only way forward. So in solidarity, see you next time. And shukran, Sara, for your voice. Activism for Palestine is truly inspiring.
Shukran ilkum. Thank you so much.
Thank you.